anybody other than the people who pay for it. That's a fact of life. It's not cynicism, it's realism. Instead of thinking that institutions are places that we can somehow magically bend to our purposes because they're full of goodwill, instead of saying, oh, Obama loves us, Biden loves us, therefore everything will be cool, we need to think of institutions as places of struggle. We need to think of institutions, whether they're the US government, the US State Department, major corporations, even universities, as places where we are constantly fighting to find our place, to make a place for ourselves, and as sites where that struggle is ongoing. It's not going to stop just because there's a friendly administration. We're still going to have to struggle to get our concerns heard, and our struggle will be fuller, more meaningful. We'll have a better chance of success if we work in coalition, in alliance with other groups. So for LGBT advocates to take up, the whole range of concerns about US policy is a good thing. It doesn't water down, it doesn't dilute the specificity of LGBT concerns. It helps us build coalitions and alliances to make our voices heard. And that's what we need to be doing. And it's what we're not doing, I'm afraid, with the US administration now, with a supposedly queer-friendly administration in office. We need to keep being confrontational. We need to keep fighting.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And apologize because this wasn't on a list of prepared questions, but now that you mentioned universities, I'd like to hear a bit more since I'm a student. This is partly about being a student, university life. So what are some of the problems with universities as far as human rights and general being decent goes, and what are good things to do about them?
Well, are you talking about the United States, or are you talking about more generally?
I mean, I was thinking kind of of the United States, even of my own university, UCLA, which I love, but administrations always need some challenging, and ours is not an exception. But also just overall around the world, it's always interesting to hear how these things play out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's a question that makes me feel old. I'm not at a university now. I talk at universities a lot, but I can't say that I have a really intimate knowledge of what goes on there. I'm going to draw on my own biography again, okay? So I'm going to talk about, I went to Harvard when I was 18. That was back in 1981, so 40 years ago. And when I look back, on Harvard, one of the major universities of the world back then, it was so white, it was so male. There were tenured women professors made up maybe 10% of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. There were almost no tenured faculty of color. And as far as the student body went, the university was talking then about making itself into a world university, but it was still, not even remotely representative of the United States. There were very few students of color, very few African Americans, almost no Latinos that I can remember. It was an oppressively patriarchal white institution. I'm not saying it's not now, but I am aware that Harvard is, like many American universities, on the course to becoming, as we say, majority minority, to having a majority of its student body made up of statistical minority identities in the United States. I think that's a great thing. But one thing that I'm constantly reminded of is how tenuous and how vulnerable that progress is. Not just how incomplete it is, because it's obviously incomplete. There are still tons of tenured white people at Harvard, disproportionate to the capacities of, the whole population of applicants for academic jobs. But how much has changed in 40 years, and how very vulnerable that progress feels. And when I hear people worrying about, cancel culture in the university and the horrors of critical race theory and the way that these things have become, weaponized by the right wing in this country. It's very clear to me that this is an effort to roll back that progress that has happened over the last 40 years, which has also enabled queer people. It's enabled all kinds of dissident and minority identities in the United States to feel that they have more of a place in education and more of a place in the intellectual life of the country. And, there are lots of people who want to roll that back. And that's part of a larger project to roll back racial equality in general on all fronts across the United States. So one thing I really feel strongly is that as a human rights issue, we need to defend the diversity of the university. We need to defend the ability of the university to represent different voices and to accommodate different identities in a respectful and dignified way. I also think that's profoundly connected to democratizing the university, which is something that hasn't been talked about very much since the 1960s, to be honest, or the 1970s. We just kind of take it for granted now that universities in the United States, like most institutions in the United States, will be essentially corporate, will be primarily beholden to the people who give money, and will not be, and somewhat beholden to the faculty, and not at all beholden to the student body. That is a big contrast between universities in the United States and universities in some other countries in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, or even universities in Eastern Europe, where I taught for many years, which have moved toward giving students more of a voice in the life of the university, more of a political role in university governance. Movements like, Rhodes Must Fall, the attempt to kind of clear away the rubbish memories of people like Cecil John Rhodes, the colonial imperialist. It's very interesting how differently they work in South Africa, where this has been a very vibrant movement, and the UK. Because in the UK, it's a student-led movement, but it still basically is supplicating the university to take down these statues of colonialists and imperialists and slavers. In South Africa, students have, partly as a legacy of the apartheid era, a much more profound sense, I think, of ownership of the university. And they're making explicit demands. This is our university. We don't want places named after Cecil John Rhodes. Tear those statues and take those names down. Having a more democratic university means a university which reflects the diversity that it says it respects, and it means a capacity for a university which is actually governed by human rights instead of just talking about it. So that would be part of my agenda for universities as we lurch forward in the 21st century.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very good. Let's see. A lot of advocacy groups become siloed and disconnected from broader movements. And it definitely makes a lot of sense to have all these different groups focused on different issues. But ultimately, what's important to be engaged with a broad spectrum of human rights, gay rights, women's rights, economic rights, a lot more, because otherwise, A, it can get inconsistent, and B, you're not going to have like big lasting coalitions on a scale that will really change everything. So what are some of the biggest problems you see here, and how can we fix them?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the identity politics question. And believe me, I think I could go on about this for hours. But how should I start? Well, let's start with the proposition that we live right now in a very difficult political moment worldwide. There are fascists prowling the streets. There were fascists in the US Capitol 4 or 5 months ago. There are neo-fascist governments in Brazil, in India. We're having to contend with a global populist, neo-fascist resurgence, which among other things is targeting various minority identities and minority groups as its would-be victims, whether they're Muslims in India, or queers in various countries from Chechnya to Egypt, or whether they're Black Lives Matter activists in the United States. There's a process of scapegoating and of targeting. Now, let me just talk about the LGBT movement, because if you people who look at the world globally and try to analyze the way LGBT rights looks, often note that there are specific countries, specific geographical areas where moral panics about queers have happened again and again and again over the last 20, 25, 30 years, really destructive moral panics. When I lived in Egypt 5 years ago, hundreds of people were being arrested, mainly trans people, but also gay men, tortured brutally, thrown into prison for anywhere from 1 to 15 years, hundreds of them. And I think the question we have to ask as advocates for LGBT people's human rights is, well, why? And people come up with all sorts of reasons. Many of them are quite congratulatory. Well, liberal countries don't have these problems. Really? Have you tried going to Mississippi lately? I mean, the United States is supposedly a liberal democracy, but we have many places in the United States where LGBT rights and other human rights, including the right to vote, are under siege. It's not a question of secularism, because these panics can happen in secular countries and religious countries, but I can tell you what part of the pattern is. I can tell you what part of the reasoning is, or what part of the reason behind this is. When I first went to Africa for a human rights trip, let's say, back in 1998. Before I left, I spoke to Zaki Ahmed, who's at the time was one of the leading LGBT rights advocates in Africa. He's South African. He later became, kind of icon of AIDS activism in South Africa and elsewhere. And at this point, there was a lot of attention focused on Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe had been saying that gays and lesbians were worse than dogs and pigs and had no right and had to be eradicated from Zimbabwe. And I was going to Zimbabwe on this trip. And I asked Zaki for his analysis of the situation. And Zaki said, look, for the last 15 years, the World Bank and the IMF have been destroying the economy of every African country, including Zimbabwe, and creating massive inequality and destroying the traditional political and economic basis of the state. And all of these governments are looking for some way to justify this to their people, to justify the repressive economic programs that they've been forced by the IMF and the World Bank to enact, and to kind of prop up their popularity. And so they pick a group that is so invisible that nobody has even seen them in Zimbabwe. I mean, LGBT people were almost totally invisible at that point. And you demonize them. It's basically the logic of witchcraft, You find witches who, precisely because they're imaginary, precisely because they're invisible, you can attribute every kind of machination to them, and you can make them responsible for the whole horror and dislocation of structural adjustment and development, or maldevelopment, or inequality and economic hardship and pain.
Yeah, it also reminds me of pretty much every anti-Semite. They're like, look over there.
Of course.
It's not what our government does. It's not the power we have. It's not that we're stealing from the people. It's that Jews exist. That is why you have problems.
Of course, but it's not just a distraction, it's actually an attempt to come up with an explanation that people can understand for what's going on to them. And this myth arose in many African countries that LGBT people are rich, that they're somehow connected to Western governments. And so every time a Western government spoke up for LGBT rights, it just confirmed this mythology, and that, they're using their influence to take away aid from Africa and destroy African economies. And it became a generalized paranoia, and it's a paranoia that has played out again and again and again in country after country, including the United States, where you